podcast where we get to talk to decision makers and policy leaders in Texas. Today we are talking with Lauren Grove. She currently works in the City of Houston's Planning and Development Department as an urban planner with experience coordinating transportation planning and projects, which improve safety for people walking and biking. Lauren's background is in clinical research, managing programs focused on mental health, brain function, and social demographic factors. She received her master's degree in urban and regional planning, focusing on physical planning and design, and bachelor's degree in neuroscience from the University of Michigan. She's leading many exciting projects in development and transportation, including on Houston's Vision Zero implementation. She's interested in expanding research on how the built environment impacts our mental health. So I've given you a brief intro. I would hand it over to you to personally introduce yourself if there's anything that I missed or you want to include.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that bio is often read, and I always have a reaction to it. Because I'm like, all right, yeah, my background's in neuroscience, and that's weird in this world. But I don't find it weird, and I'm excited to talk about that. But yeah, I've been at the city for a little over 2.5 years. I moved to Houston sight unseen from Detroit, and I did a little bit of work in Ann Arbor, Michigan on streetscaping projects. But this role in the planning department at the City of Houston is really my first step into transportation planning and policy and programming. I'm really looking at the broader level of how our programs and plans, are implemented. So it's all a learning experience for me, and still consider myself a new transportation planner out of grad school, but 2.5 years has gone by. I don't know when can have to stop saying that.
Right. At what point are you not a beginner anymore?
Right.
So you mentioned that you're kind of new to the field relatively. What do you wish that someone had told you when you were first getting started in planning? Or, what are some skills or knowledge that you think it's important for people to know to prepare to go into this kind of field?
I had a few professors prepare me for working as a planner, which at the time I scoffed at. I was like, whatever. But looking back, I'm grateful. A lot of it was, it's a slow process, and you're going to want it to move quicker, but there are so many parts to it. It's just going to be a slow process, and I still find myself fighting that, even though I see it sort of the push for change is, I see it happening, but it's just way slower than I would like it to be. So I'm always reminding myself of that, and anybody else I talk to, that it is slow, and as much as I want that to change, might not be in my best interest to be one person trying to move things along. I also think now what I would tell people is you're going to get stressed out, and that's okay. It's a good thing, and that's why it's so important to have planners who are really eager to make that change and push continually. But just it's a stressful thing to do. So
what do you think has been the most surprising thing, or something that has been an adjustment that you weren't really expecting?
I think I don't know, because there's so much at first that you have envisioned for. I think planning touches so many things that it's really often difficult to focus on any one particular thing. So I kind of have had to adjust that, being able to relate how everything is connected, but trying to move things along in one particular area, and not saying, well, I got to bring this in and this in and that in, and it really does sort of add some layers that necessarily don't need to be there. So I think I've had to adjust in my okay, this is where our focus is. It's related to a lot of other things, and that's exciting, but like being able to focus on this one particular change or policy or program is something I've had to learn to
Yeah,
adjust.
and I think since several of the interns are studying public policy rather than planning, but I think that that is something that definitely holds true in the policy world as well. Is everything that every policy that can be proposed is going to affect more than just the one thing that it targets. So that is kind of a necessary skill to have in both of these fields, is to be able to say that, you know, you're looking at a desired outcome, and you have to be mindful that you don't have negative outcomes for other things. But you know, that is something that is an intersection that you can't get away from a lot of the time. It's just that what you're wanting to do is going to have many other effects, and it's just a balancing game of, you know, how good can this be in this one aspect while minimizing the risks or the harm in other ways. What do you most often find that you wish policymakers or people with policy backgrounds understood more about planning?
Um, I think I think planners are guilty of this too. So I wouldn't say it's specific to policy, but I would say thinking about what it looks like on the ground is oftentimes something sort of similar to what we were just talking about, right? Like um, everything's related and it's really hard. You may negatively impact one area by changing this one policy. And I think that's sort of like thinking about what this policy looks like on the ground. And I know that's so hard to do in planning too, thinking about how a plan is going to actually be implemented and what that looks like in the real world. I feel like
Right.
there's this talking to engineers, it's always like, you planners up in the sky with your ideas. It's
Mhm.
like, okay, maybe a little bit. But yeah, thinking more about what that how that would play out in our communities and in the environment that we're in, and what those things really look like. I think there's always room for improvement for that.
So have you found that in your interactions with policy people and with engineers and all of the other worlds that touch planning, that you've developed any sort of specific skills or knowledge that you didn't have before? Like maybe like you've learned how to be a really persuasive elevator pitcher, right? Or something like that.
Um, I don't know if I like, there's this idea of like, yeah, an elevator pitch or sort of the 3 sentences to summarize. It feels very salesy, which to me just
Yeah.
does not feel genuine. I know some people like that's all that they want to hear. Just tell me get straight to it, lay it out for me. I think what I've learned is that if I'm speaking genuinely about a particular program or policy or change, um, and I know what the intended outcome is, that speaks volumes more than like trying to wrap it in a pretty package and fit it into a few sentences. As much as yeah, as much as I want to do that, I struggle with that. So that's something I've learned.
Yeah, I think that it's an important approach to understand that you have to be genuine in both your intent and your execution, because this it's not just like you were saying pie in the sky. Like these aren't just ideas, they're it's material influences on people's lives on the ground. So speaking of residents and people on the ground, what do you wish that maybe the community was more involved with um, in Houston, or more in tune with, like in your world?
Mm, that's a really great question. And even though I got the questions beforehand, I struggle with this one.
I think
Um,
a lot of stuff that people could be aware of, you know.
there's so much that people could be aware of, and in my heart I'm like, it's right there. Like when I talk to people outside of work, I talk to people who aren't in my transportation world, just friends or family, even in Houston and outside. It's like people are talking about it as if they are planners or transportation planners or advocates. They just don't know it yet. So oftentimes when I say I'm a transportation planner, they go off on, what about this intersection, and can we do something about traffic here, and what about this sidewalk? And I'm like, this is
You got
great to, Yeah. It's that like push just beyond that I think planners and would like to see the community do more of, and vice versa. Like, how can I, as a planner, is there a tool, is there a communication strategy that would sort of take that community feedback to the next level? And is there a way to let communities know they are advocates and there are outlets to what you're telling me in a conversation actually formalize? And I think like there's a gap there, and I don't know how we can decrease that gap or bridge it. But I do think people are so passionate about cities, and they are their own like little planners. They just don't know it yet. So if there's any way that, you know, we can, we as professionals can work to make their voices better heard, that's what I would love to see.
Yeah, I think that some great planning comes out when you couple that experience of living in that place and experiencing what it's like to be in that community, and, with the knowledge that it takes to understand the ins and outs of how that gets done and how intersections are made and who decides whether there's a roundabout or not. And I think that that's something that I know personally, as a person who was not really steeped in transportation policy before this summer, it's not something that you think of as having like an overarching entity or sort of like an institutional or structural arm behind it, because it kind of seems like roads just happen, and you know that somewhere down the line there's state budgets involved, but you're not really sure how it goes about it, because it's not sexy policy. Like, people don't want to talk about that as often. So yeah, I definitely think that this can change a lot, which is people being interested in it and having people with the knowledge reaching out. What are you some successes that you're most proud of, either in terms of your personal involvement or just witnessing in the community happening in the planning world?
So I think there was a period of time before I started working on Vision Zero at the city of Houston, and we were doing rapid implementation of our Houston bike plan. So there was a challenge from the county and a challenge from our bike advocacy group, Bike Houston, to build 50 miles of bikeway in a year and spend $10 million in funding on bikeways. And I think I think the success was really sort of the after of this process, because number one, if you go out to a community and you say, we have funding for this particular thing, in theory, that sounds really wonderful and really great, but that's kind of, there's a other side of that, which is it's not exactly what the community wants. So in this particular instance, we were working in communities as part of the Complete Communities initiative that Mayor Turner started, recognizing communities that have been underserved and under-resourced traditionally, and saying, you know, we are going to focus our efforts on community plans in these specific communities, and really getting to know what their needs are. And a lot of that was related to mobility and transportation, but it was things like, you know, I don't have sidewalks here. Get me some sidewalks. I've got to walk in the street right now. Or there's no street lighting and my kid's school is a block away, but I drive him because it's just not safe. And so we came in and said, that we hear you, but the money is for this particular thing. And I think, though, what the success was being able to take that feedback, even though it wasn't the funding wasn't directly for those types of things, we were still able to provide improvements to the street outside of the bikeway money. So I think those communities speaking up enough, having this sort of already community-built relationship established, allowed us to, in some way, express that there are needs outside of bikeways, and if there's any way that we could use this money towards those needs, we need to be doing that. And so I think it took a little while, and it took enough of the community to keep talking about it, but it did happen to where it wasn't just implementing bikeways. We were able to improve sidewalks, improve ADA ramps, improve bus stops through the bikeway funding. So I think that that was a success.
Well, speaking of programs that are supposed to make communities safer, Vision Zero, as you know, is one of Farm&City's major initiatives, and is also being worked on in Houston that you're involved with. For those of you at home, the goal is to bring the number of traffic fatalities and serious injuries to zero by 2035. Will you please talk a bit about how Houston's Vision Zero program is faring and kind of what progress has been made?
Sure. First of all, I think, major kudos to Jay, because before I even came to Houston, he laid the groundwork for a lot of Vision Zero. I found some bits and pieces in like files on our server when I first started about email exchanges with Pat Walsh, who was the director at the time, and just, I mean, I know there was a lot of work that went into the conversation itself about Houston being a Vision Zero city. So I think I came along and, the conversation, it was brought up again with Mayor Turner, why aren't we doing Vision Zero? And there was enough interest and I think, sort of voice from the community that street safety and just getting around in Houston was not safe, that Mayor Turner said, okay, let's figure out what this is going to look like. And so in August of 2019 is when the city formalized adopting Vision Zero, which I know is a really critical part of, that commitment, is really formalizing it in some way, having some sort of policy statement that outlines what your Vision Zero strategy is going to look like. And for Houston, that was really focusing on safety and accessibility for people with disabilities specifically. So we know that Vision Zero is a strategy for all road users, but in Houston, we really wanted to focus on those two prioritizations, and every project need to be safety and accessibility. So for every project, that needs to be what we're measuring. How are we making this safe, and how are we making it accessible for everybody? And so since August of 2019, it's been bringing city departments, partner agencies to the table and collaborating to talk about what are the existing efforts related to street safety, and then what are the gaps? What are we missing? Where do we need to go? Those city departments are, your typical ones that you would think about, like public works and police. Mm-hmm. But we also brought to the table public health and our advocacy groups like Bike Houston and Link Houston. We brought to the table our Metro, transit agency, TxDOT, and other groups that do have a really big role in street safety, and said, okay, how do we do this? And I can't believe I say August of 2019, and in my head, I'm like, oh yeah, it was just a couple of months ago. That was a year ago. And we have been meeting formally as like committees. So we have working groups related to data and communications. We have a task force of, people that are really going to be doing the work. And then we have our leadership, executive level group that meets on a regular basis to talk about progress, to talk about crash data, to talk about how we're going to make this culture shift in Houston, which is such a car-centric city. And oftentimes people are like, no way, it's just how it is. You can't, they can do that in other places, but not in Houston. We're not like that. So it's just, even internally, it's about having those conversations, recognizing the problem that people are dying on our roadways every day, and that's not okay. Establishing that internally first, and then recognizing what are the policies and programs and plans that need to be tied to a goal of zero, and then where are the gaps. So our action plan is due out in September, end of September of this year, and it will be focused on all of those, conversations on our community engagement efforts that unfortunately are limited to virtual open houses and public meetings. We'd love to get out to the community. That's what we'd be doing right now. But the action plan is going to incorporate everything that we've heard that the community wants, that our committees recognize needs to happen, and it'll be as part of an action plan, and that action plan is going to have some measurable things. It's going to be, all right, planning department, you're going to be doing this, and okay, public works, you're going to be charged with doing these things, and every one of them is going to have some sort of measurable metric tied to it. So it's not just create a pedestrian safety action plan. It's no, fill 25 blocks of sidewalk gaps every year, and that's ultimately tied to pedestrian safety. So we're really hoping it has some meat to it. We cannot afford to have a plan that just sits on a shelf, which is a term that a lot of planners use because it happens way too often. So yeah, we're working as hard as we can to engage with as many people to get those measurable actions in a plan by the end of September, and be doing the things we know that we can do right now to improve street safety.
Well, anytime there is a big collaboration between interests and departments like this, there tends to be some sort of cross interest at points, and even though everyone can agree that we should have 0 people dying, some interests are involved that make that a little bit difficult to navigate and to get people on board. Have you found that there have been any particular sticking points in moving forward with Vision Zero in Houston?
I mean, I think that's a great point. Like everybody is on board with ending traffic deaths. I mean, nobody's going to really say, yeah, I don't really want to do that. But then there's the in between, right? It's like how do we actually get there? I think you can make that commitment. You can make a commitment to Vision Zero, and it sounds really great. Right. But it's the challenge of boiling down what these departments are going to do, and that, like, we're literally in that right now. So we're scheduling meetings with Public Works and police and these departments that are going to play a really big role to assess their level of commitment to these actions, to see what is feasible. And I think that will be really telling of the challenge. I remember when we started this effort, and I'm sure, Jay can speak to this, or I spoke to Jay at one point about how important it is to have a really strong leader or champion of Vision Zero at the mayoral level, either in the mayor's office or just, the mayor himself being a huge champion of Vision Zero, because that sets like the level of accountability for the departments. Because if the person in charge is asking, what are we doing about this regularly, it's going to make the plan so much more powerful and make it even more likely to be implemented. And I think, I think that that's there. I think that's happening. I think there are more people at that level who are recognizing how important it is. But I think the challenge right now is the sort of the weeds that we're in right now of saying, we have this action to change speed limits on city streets and we need everybody's backing. Are you on board? I think those will be some interesting conversations.
Yes, for sure. Madeline has a question also about this kind of topic.
Sure.
I think you mentioned outreach earlier, and I know for the past few years, and especially in the past few months, there have been a lot of discussions within planning as a discipline about how to best engage with the public, especially with communities that have historically been silenced or kept out of that process in one way or another. But then also in the last few months, a lot of people have been suggesting that COVID is a great opportunity to sort of test run a lot of projects about pedestrian safety, or just like pop-up projects to test ideas. So how can we balance opportunities to sort of test run those projects or to meet the new massive demand for use of public spaces while also balancing that with the responsibility to like do the due diligence and get community feedback for those things.
Yeah. So I have a few thoughts on that. I think right now we are seeing more people just recognizing the need for public spaces because of COVID, which is a nice silver lining. I think people are recognizing that that's something they should have advocated for or could have advocated for previously, right? It's always there. I think there's a voice of communities because of not only COVID, but racial injustice that has been happening. And so you have COVID, which is recognizing health disparities and disparities in our health system. You have racial injustice, which is raising people's awareness and voice around an issue that impacts everybody. And more people are speaking up about both of these really important quality of life things. And I think somehow there's and also a recognition of the space around us that, you know, now that everybody's speaking up about it, I feel empowered to speak up about other things. And we're able to engage better with communities who may have been, who may not have wanted to talk about it or express things in these spaces, or who, you know, felt like they couldn't, or because we just are all virtual sphere, we're creating everything online for people to give feedback, but we still are finding a gap in going out and reaching people. I think there's, I think, you know, our community, or like civic spaces, our community centers are open because those communities need it so badly. Our schools are still open. And so that's an opportunity for us to engage with people who are really in need of those resources and talk about the type of spaces that they would want. I just think that there's this like shift happening in people recognizing that our city should do more for us, and that I am empowered to like have that. I'm not sure that many people recognize like I can ask for this and I should ask for this and I have every right to ask for this. I don't know if I answered that question, but that's just what came to mind.
I definitely think so. And especially in cities where people are feeling more comfortable, like taking a more active role in control of the places where they live. But obviously city governments are not the only entities that sort of play a role in how things are done and what gets planned or funded. So what do you think might be some of the biggest challenges to sort of get some of those other entities, cities, counties, metropolitan planning organizations to make commitments or adjust their practices to make sure that these things can all get done, like traffic safety or improving equitability in our systems?
Yeah. So this is where I think I mentioned it like really briefly, but the commitment is one thing, and I think the substance of the commitment is another component. So I think from my experience, a lot of the groups that we're working with are on board. They recognize traffic safety as important, that we should end, you know, traffic deaths, and they're committed. I think the importance there is boiling that down a little bit more and what that really means. And I honestly think, like, I've had the thought recently, I'm like, I kind of want to stop saying safety like traffic safety, there's something about it that is already becoming, that's not meaningful for me anymore. It's not just about it being safe. And so I think we can talk about our agencies and partners committing to improving traffic safety, but we have to tie that to our broader quality of life goals, right? We have to tie that to housing. We have to tie that to land use. We have to make it mean more than just traffic safety. It's part of a bigger picture. And so I think that's where we can bring along more people and have more buy-in and support for improving street safety, if we tie it to these broader goals and make that commitment a little bit more meaningful for everybody. They may not see the direct tie, and I think that's part of our role is to make it make that commitment have a bit more comprehensive nature.
I think that ties into my next question. So Houston, is like nationally famous for the way that it does land use regulation. People say it's, the city without zoning, even though it kind of does through other tools. So I was just wondering if you could talk about how Houston's unique, the unique way that it plans, how that could create unique issues or maybe opportunities for transportation planning in the city. Like maybe it's a great thing that Houston doesn't have wide swaths of single family zoning at the city level. Maybe that could make Houston a great bike city.
Yeah, this is a huge question, and I always want to find like the silver bullet answer, like, aha, yes. The no zoning in Houston is different from all these other places because it allows for, or it limits, or whatever. And I struggle with that. I think there's some things are just a little bit more difficult or easier because of the land use regulations in Houston. I don't know that there's one specific thing or a unique thing. I think about just the number of curb cuts and driveways that when I came from Michigan, I was like blown away that every few feet it was like driveway, curb cut, curb cut, curb cut. I've never seen anything like that before. I've seen it pop up just being in the planning world in other cities, and it's a problem. So I don't think it's necessarily unique to Houston. In that way, I think where land use comes into play with transportation in Houston specifically is thinking about the access near frontage roads and near our freeways. That is something that I've heard from other people is somewhat it's a lot in Houston. So the frontage road it's a surface level street, and there are businesses and shopping centers and even housing that are right adjacent to this surface street that really is just an extension of the highway. And I think there is where Houston could really make some transformative progress in merging land use and transportation is setting some design standards for our frontage roads and the land use that is adjacent to them. We know that frontage roads and highways are a huge traffic safety concern, and I think there's how are we expecting people to get to those shopping centers or plazas or whatever when there's like 10 massive lanes of high-speed traffic? I think there's a lot of room for improvement there in terms of that land use component. That's something I see that we could really improve in Houston, and look to other cities to see what they're doing.
Yeah, I also think that, Houston has similar problems to other cities in terms of how sort of exclusionary neighborhoods and the racial component of how we plan cities and where we put certain kinds of people has contributed to Houston's notorious traffic problem, similarly to Atlanta and Austin, you know. So I think land use is something that is kind of maybe the secret part of transportation planning that, you know, transportation planners try to remember, but people, you know, my friends don't think about how where you put things creates the problem of how to get there, you know. So if we want to solve some of these other higher level problems, then we need to look at where we're putting stuff to begin with. So
what? Where you put stuff affects whether or not people are able to get there?
just something to consider.
Well, I have a quick question that's not directly related to that, but is kind of similar in this idea of what we build and kind of what kind of impacts it has on society. And so you are passionate, if I remember correctly, about the built environment's impacts on mental health. And so I was just kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this and like what kind of a relationship that is, and what we could be doing better. We, I guess, is like Austin or Houston or Texas in general.
Yeah. I think about this a lot because I think there's a lot of research that can be done in this area, in this intersection of the built environment and in our mental health. And I think there's at least two levels that I think of when I think about this. So I think the first is just the built environment and our perception of it. So I'm going to perceive the built environment differently than you would perceive it, and you're going to perceive it differently than the next person would perceive it. And you know that depends on our nature and nurture and sort of the biological components of that. But then the built environment influences also how I perceive things, right? So how we design is going to change or influence my perception of whether I want to go for a walk on this street or the next block. So it's sort of both ways, right? Lauren, my biology and my makeup is going to perceive the environment differently, and the environment is then going to influence my perception. So I think that's why that intersection about how we're thinking of designing our built environment is so important, because just by the way of certain components of the design, we can influence whether somebody wants to interact with it or not. And we can think about how we're wired and how people attune to certain components of the built environment depending on what things look like. And there's a lot of really awesome research out there that's starting to look at the intersection of like neuroscience and planning. And one of the studies I'm thinking about is out of the Boston Institute for Human Design, and they looked at eye tracking and showed participants photos of cities and monitored their eye tracking. And surprise, surprise, people are attracted to people. So in all of these photos, even if the person was just a small speck and there were all these beautiful buildings surrounding it, people would spend more than half of their attention on that person. And so if we really, start to think about what that means, we start to understand better why it's so important to create spaces for people that are safe, that people want to go to, because then I'm drawn to that space. And you could take that even further and think about other ways to measure our brains and our bodies and our stress levels, using EEG and thinking about my brain and the reaction there to the environment, and how that then either maybe I feel okay going to this location because of its open nature, there's lighting, it feels inclusive, I feel like I belong there. There's a lot of different components. Or I get really anxious and I'm just like not going to do it. But we can think about that when we especially think about transportation too, how we're designing our systems to be inclusive of everybody. We really need to be thinking about what are those really finite components of the system that would invite me or make me feel like I don't want to do that. Like I don't feel like this is, for me. And so I think that intersection is just really fascinating. And I, uh, am constantly thinking about how to marry those two even more and bring them forward. I think the other second component is our actual like diagnosable mental health. And 25% of Americans, so 1 in 4 of us, have a diagnosable mental health condition. And that is even more exacerbated when we think about our urban centers and cities. So those people with a mental health condition are, disproportionately impacted in, especially so in cities. And I think there are some really key factors in thinking about how we're designing for people with mental health conditions. This is not only on the level of the components of design, but just in general, access to resources are more difficult to reach for people with mental health conditions. So we think about getting to my appointment at the clinic and maybe I don't have a license, I can't drive for a variety of factors, and my access to the bus is out of reach. We're really not thinking inclusively about everybody if we're not considering mental health as a component there. And so, again, I think there's some research being done. I think there's more to say about that, though, that we can think about just how critical our transportation systems are to providing alternate options to getting to where I need to go. And then, that's the A to B, the means to an end thing. But in general, having those transportation options just improves our quality of life too. And I think there's a lot of fascinating research about just the really different components that go into designing our spaces and thinking about mental health. So.
Yeah.
I was going to say that speaking of mental health and the built environment, Houston Tomorrow has suggested converting many urban residential streets into neighborhood greenways that would help with both traffic safety and flood mitigation, which would add design features like bioswales and vegetated roundabouts and other city calming measures that can help slow and reduce runoff. But these are also, plants, right? And studies have shown that more green areas and looking at plants actually helps people with their mental health and improves happiness and state of mind. So that's kind of the tie there. But what do you think a project like Neighborhood Greenways could do for Houston? What are some things that you think would be really, really great? Really great progress, or what are some challenges that you see for implementing a project like this?
So when I first moved to Houston, one of my first questions I asked is like, why are we not doing more, bikeways or greenways that also help to mitigate flooding? I was like, this is like the place to be doing that and experimenting. Like Houston could really be a leader. These are like, talk about two major concerns for Houstonians, traffic and flooding, and the opportunity to mitigate both of those through greenway opportunities. I never really got an answer from people, or people are just like, I don't know. But I do see that, this neighborhood greenways being an opportunity to shift the identity for Houston, like make it not about Houston traffic and flooding, but like Houston's identity grounded in like they're the go-to place to talk about making it safer for people, making increasing the options for alternate transit by making these really nice greenways, and also the greenways help in other issues related to flooding and stormwater management. I'm super excited about that. I don't think that conversation is being had enough here, and I'd love to see more talk. And I think with the Resilient Houston strategy and the Climate Action Plan, I'm hoping that those those components will start rising to the top more now that we have more plans calling for sustainable practices, and really making that a key component in everything that we do. I'm hoping that those conversations will increase. I think the challenge, and I only say this because in grad school I did a semester working in Detroit on green stormwater management systems, and I focused on the governance side of it. So like how do we create policies that allow for stormwater management systems on vacant lots? Because as the policy was written in Detroit, wouldn't really allow for that. How do we then hand that land over to the neighboring parcel, and they would then manage it and have some sort of subsidy, tax benefit? But the policy really wasn't in place. So I focused on the governance side, and what I saw is just like the structure, the organization is not really in place for like a broad green stormwater management system. And so I think I would imagine that might be the case in Houston too, just like establishing how that sort of program would work if we went that route. But that's just, pulling from back in the day, my immediate thought there.
Well, there is, I think I feel the same way. There's amazing potential there, I think there's the Southeast Houston Transformation Alliance, and I think they have some federal money, and so they will be starting to do some neighborhood greenways in that neighborhood. So that'll be the start, and we'll
Awesome.
have some on the ground. But then I think, as you're saying, it can be a huge part of like Harvey recovery. Is why not do this everywhere if you can figure it out.
Right.
So
yeah.
Well, that's all the questions that I have for you. If anybody else has any, we can ask them now. Are we all good?
I really appreciated your presentation at the Texas Pedestrian Safety Forum yesterday. So thank you very much. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Thanks so much, Lauren.
Okay, everybody. This was Policy Drivers with Lauren Grove. Thank you very much.